Mascots have been a huge part of gaming ever since the very beginning. It feels like every successful gaming company has at least one character that separates itself from the rest and begins to represent that company and brand. Nintendo has Mario, Xbox has Master Chief, Sega has Sonic. But as I started to think about it more, I realized that one of the largest companies ever doesn't really have a defined mascot, and that company is PlayStation. This got me thinking about which character could be considered PlayStation's mascot if we had to pick one. In order to make that decision, let's look back at PlayStation's history and see what mascots they've had in the past and who could qualify as their mascot today. Before we get started, we need to talk about Toro Inu. Toro Inu is a pretty unknown character here in North America, but in Japan, Toro has been viewed as the PlayStation mascot ever since the PlayStation 1. He is even commonly known as the Sony cat. Toro comes from the Doko Demo Iso line of games. These games have spanned a variety of genres, including life sim games, virtual pet games, and even adventure games. These games have always been fairly popular in Japan, however, maybe not to the level you would expect from a mascot character. Regardless, Toro became a staple for PlayStation Japan, and I can see why. He's a cute character and definitely has all the attributes of a mascot type. He's perfect for merchandise, commercials, or even a giant mascot costume. It's super interesting to see Toro become such a fixture in PlayStation's Japanese culture when the character is basically completely unknown anywhere else. Toro has very rarely made appearances in any games released in North America. Toro's most notable appearance would no doubt be his role in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale as a playable character. Toro's status as PlayStation's official mascot staying in Japan was not an accident. In 2002, official US PlayStation magazine reported that the American Sony branch did not want to have one character representing the brand. So while PlayStation Japan was pushing Toros to the heights we've seen him have today, PlayStation America was purposely trying to avoid him. That just feels cruel to the poor little guy. Anyways, I definitely wanted to mention Toro and give the character its credit, because yes, in Japan, Toro is undoubtedly PlayStation's mascot. But I'm not in Japan, I'm an American, and only my culture matters. But no, seriously, that wouldn't be a very fun video if I just ended it there, right? So going forward, do as PlayStation America did in the 2000s and pretend that this little cat doesn't exist. Everything we talk about next will be from the perspective of PlayStation in North America. So with that in mind, let's go back to the very beginning of the PlayStation brand. There have only been a few times in PlayStation's history that I can confidently say they had a brand mascot, and one of those times would be in the very beginning with the PlayStation 1. In the 90s, Sony were the newcomers to the console market, competing with industry staples like Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo and Sega have two of the most iconic and recognizable mascots in the entire world, with Mario and Sonic. Those two characters have transcended gaming, reaching a status that most can only dream of. You can genuinely walk up to almost anyone in the world, and they will have at least heard of Mario and Sonic. So when PlayStation looked to make its mark on the gaming world, it's not all too surprising they went down a similar path with a character called Crash Bandicoot. I'm not sure if they were planning on Crash to become their mascot, but it definitely happened that way after his debut game released. When Crash Bandicoot released on September 9th, 1996, it was an immediate hit. The game sold over 6 million copies, making it one of the best-selling PS1 games ever. Crash very quickly separated himself and became the face of the PlayStation brand. And Crash was a perfect fit for the PlayStation mascot. He was a colorful, unique character that fit the archetype you would expect from a mascot. On top of that, Crash's games were some of the best representations of what was possible with the PS1 hardware. Crash's games helped Sony stand out in a saturated market. Meanwhile, PlayStation continued building Crash's brand through some iconic marketing campaigns featuring the character. My personal favorite is of course the famous PS1 commercial where Crash goes to Nintendo's headquarters and taunts them with a megaphone. As we inched closer to the PS2 era, Crash was holding strong as PlayStation's mascot. But all of that was about to change. Despite Crash becoming the face of PlayStation, Sony actually did not own the rights to the character. Universal Interactive held the rights, and Sony had just signed on as co-publisher. After seeing Crash's popularity, Sony attempted to buy the rights, but Universal wasn't interested. This led to PlayStation losing Crash as an exclusive character, and all future Crash Bandicoot games becoming multi-platform. Crash did remain synonymous with PlayStation in the eyes of many, even to this day, but obviously he can't qualify as PlayStation's mascot if his games are on competing hardware. There was one other character who many considered a mascot during the PS1 era, and that was Spyro the Dragon. Spyro's games were equally as successful and influential as Crash. I think Crash took the crown as mascot simply because the game was released a year earlier than Spyro. If Spyro had come first, I could easily see a world where Spyro becomes PlayStation's first mascot. Ultimately though, it wouldn't have mattered much because Spyro suffered the exact same fate as Crash. Spyro was also owned by Universal and also went multi-platform after the first 3 games in that series. Right as PlayStation was gearing up for the PS2 era, they had lost the rights to their two most popular characters. The good news was they were able to keep their relationship with the developers of Crash, Naughty Dog, and the developers of Spyro, Insomniac. So now it was time to get to work with those studios to create new characters that could take the mantle as Mascot. Oh, also shout out Parappa the Rapper, you deserved more games. And there was also this monstrosity called Polygon Man that was used in early marketing, but audiences hated him and he was barely used, so no, he doesn't count. As I mentioned earlier, PlayStation America had decided they didn't want one single character to represent their brand. I would assume this is because of the Crash situation and how badly it ended. PlayStation saw how quickly you could lose your iconic characters and they did not want that to happen again. And looking back, it could have been pretty catastrophic when PlayStation lost Crash and Spyro. But as we all know, things worked out just fine, with the PlayStation 2 becoming the best-selling gaming console of all time. Part of the reason that console became so successful was because it was the cheapest way to get a DVD player at the time. But the other reason for its success was the incredible output of games. Every PlayStation first-party team really brought it this generation, including the two teams who had had their IPs taken from them. Naughty Dog released the Jak and Daxter trilogy, while Insomniac also released a new trilogy with Ratchet and Clank. Now, as much as I love and respect Jak and Daxter, I think it's clear to see that Ratchet and Clank took the crown for this generation. The Ratchet and Clank games sold significantly better and have continued to be a face of PlayStation to this day, while Jak and Daxter have kind of been left behind since the PS2 era. Just like Crash Bandicoot, Ratchet and Clank were a perfect representation of the PlayStation brand at the time. They were similar to other gaming mascots, having heavily marketable designs and coming from a platforming game. But Ratchet and Clank's games were a bit edgier and more mature than what you saw from other platforming mascots. And this edgy, cool personality fit alongside how the PlayStation brand was being viewed at that time as well. There were definitely some other characters from this era that deserve a mention, such as Sly Cooper and Kratos. Kratos is definitely an interesting one because we need to discuss if he really qualifies as a mascot. So far, the mascots we've discussed here have all been cute little animals, which is common. But can a Spartan warrior who killed his family be considered a mascot? I guess that depends on your interpretation of it. If your definition of a mascot is a character that can be made into a giant plush costume for someone to walk around in, then I guess Kratos isn't your guy. But if your definition of a mascot is someone who becomes synonymous with the brand and company, then I think Kratos has a really good argument here. To be fair though, this was early in the God of War franchise, so we can hold off on Kratos and talk about him a little more later. Also, I'll give a shout out to Titus from Final Fantasy X. I know he isn't from a direct PlayStation IP, but whenever I think about the PS2, I just see this box art in my head. And with Final Fantasy X and X-2 being some of the best-selling PS2 games, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other people consider these games whenever they think about the PS2. I feel like I don't have much else to say about the PS2 era because, yeah, there really wasn't one character that rose above the rest and became the defined mascot. PlayStation didn't want one character representing them, and they did a great job achieving that goal. It's hard for me to crown one character simply because there were so many iconic ones from this generation. However, I am officially making my pick Ratchet and Clank. Growing up, I always saw Ratchet and Clank in the same way I saw Mario, Sonic, or Rayman. Ratchet and Clank were PlayStation to me. And despite the Ratchet franchise continuing to this day, whenever I see these two, I just can't help but think about the PS2. Characters like Ratchet and Clank and Kratos continued to be among PlayStation's best during the PS3 era. However, I wouldn't say those characters defined the generation. That title would go to two of the new IPs released during the PS3 era. First, let's talk about my runner-up for the PlayStation mascot in this era, which would be Nathan Drake from Uncharted. I feel strange calling Nathan Drake a mascot since he's just a dude, but he really did become synonymous with the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation brand in general. Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 pushed the technical limits of the console and showed what it was capable of. On that topic, I want to talk about a qualification I'm going to consider for the more modern era of mascots. What I'm going to keep in mind is how often PlayStation will pull out the character or franchise during a big moment for the company. Uncharted is the perfect example of this. Uncharted Drake's Fortune was one of the first must-have games for the PS3, and Uncharted 2 and 3 were even bigger and better. I'm not sure if the PS3 would have had the success it had in the second half of its life cycle without the Uncharted franchise. When the PS Vita was released, the big first-party launch title title chosen to represent the portable was an Uncharted game with Uncharted Golden Abyss. In 2013, to celebrate the launch of the PS4, PlayStation released an Uncharted PS4 teaser trailer. And then, just a few years ago, when Sony decided to go all in with television and movie adaptations, what was the first franchise they chose? You guessed it, Uncharted. Uncharted has been one of Sony's go-to franchises for new consoles or initiatives that need a boost. That makes Nathan Drake a prime candidate for PlayStation's mascot. I would have given him that status if it wasn't for a certain someone else who debuted during the PS3 era. Little Big Planet was such a magical game. It was so imaginative and fun and so ahead of its time. It was also very different from everything else in PlayStation's catalog at the time. And it all starred this little guy, Sackboy. I remember when Little Big Planet came out, people said PlayStation had finally found their Mario. Part of the reason they were saying that was just because Little Big Planet was a 2D platformer, but it was also because of Sackboy, who quickly became an iconic character. Sackboy has the perfect charm to him, a well-designed character who is easy enough for anybody to understand. He's perfect for merchandise and marketing. Not to mention, he was featured in a whole lot of games. In fact, Sackboy has had a completely new game released on every PlayStation console since his creation. Not even characters like Kratos, Nathan Drake, or Ratchet and Clank can say that. To be clear when I say this, I'm not including collections or remakes like God of War Collection on Vita or Ratchet and Clank on PS4. When researching a bit for this video, Sackboy was a common answer to see when others had asked the question, who is PlayStation's mascot? Many even wondered why the question was being asked at all because they had just assumed Sackboy was the official mascot. Little Big Planet became one of those franchises so big in the 2010s that almost every gamer had played it, either on their own or at a friend's house. Just for the simple fact that so many people online already assumed Sackboy was the official PlayStation mascot during the PS3 era, I have to give him the nod. And it helps that he fits the archetype of a mascot character better than someone like Nathan Drake. And I mean, come on, they gave him a damn kart racing game. That's like Mascot 101. I'm including the PS4 and PS5 together since the PS5 era isn't over yet, and also because I feel like most of the characters of significance during the PS4 era are still the most relevant characters today. First of all, we have to give some major props to Kratos and Ratchet and Clank for being the only characters who have stood the test of time. They've made it all the way from the PS2 era and are still among PlayStation's top characters. Kratos has definitely overtaken Ratchet and Clank in popularity now though, with the Norse Saga games becoming major sellers. There's a definite argument to be made here that Kratos is PlayStation's current mascot. With the current popularity of the God of War games combined with the staying power of the franchise over the last 20 years, Kratos is hard to beat, but there are some candidates. I think Ellie from The Last of Us deserves a shout out here. As one of PlayStation's most popular characters, she frequently appears in their marketing. And popularity of The Last of Us reached new heights recently with the HBO show. But I feel like The Last of Us games have been too infrequent, with only 2 games in the 11 years since the franchise debuted in 2013. Saying The Last of Us came out 11 years ago just made my head spin. But yeah, I mean, this is a pretty central issue most characters have when it comes to their mascot candidacy. Long are the days where we would get full trilogies in single console generations. Nowadays, if we get 2 games in a franchise during one console generation, we're excited. So that inherently makes it harder for new characters to achieve that iconic, legendary status. However, there are 2 characters who have gotten quite a lot of releases since their debut on PS4. The first feels like a bit of a cheat, but I gotta mention him, and that's Spider-Man. Spider-Man PS4 was one of the most popular and iconic games of that generation. And moving into the PS5 generation, we had a Spider-Man game there day one with Miles Morales. And in 2023, we got Spider-Man 2. Based on some of the information we got from the Insomniac hack, we know a lot more Spider-Man is coming. These games have become synonymous with PlayStation, and it feels pretty fitting considering the film rights of Spider-Man are also owned by Sony. But I don't think I can say Spider-Man is PlayStation's mascot. The Spider-Man character is so much larger than that, with way too many other interpretations or attachments to ever be considered just a PlayStation thing. The other character to debut from the PS4 era was Aloy from Horizon, and I'm not gonna lie, I think Aloy has a pretty solid case for PlayStation mascot. Now I'm sure some of you are rolling your eyes right now because for some reason Horizon has become kind of a hated franchise, but personally I really love these games. And regardless about how you feel about Horizon, you can't deny Sony's commitment to it. Throughout this video, I've said mascots are someone who becomes synonymous with the brand, represents what is possible with the company's hardware, and also becomes a go-to representation representative for the company's biggest new products and initiatives. I would say Aloy and Horizon fit into all of those categories. The Horizon games constantly push the PlayStation hardware and are there for new hardware launches. Horizon Zero Dawn came just a few months after PS4 Pro. Forbidden West was one of the first major PlayStation Studios games shown and marketed for PS5. And for PlayStation VR 2, Horizon Call of the Mountain was there day one as a launch title. On top of that, Horizon Zero Dawn was the first game Sony chose to port to PC at the start of that initiative. We haven't even mentioned all of the rumored projects such as Horizon 3, the Horizon multiplayer game, the Horizon MMO, the Zero Dawn remake, or the Horizon TV show. Clearly, Sony values this IP a whole lot. Many would argue they value it a little too much, and even as someone who does like the games, I may tend to agree. Sony is pushing so much Horizon stuff out the door when a lot of us really only want Horizon 3. Aloy is far from the most popular character in the eyes of many on the internet, but you can't deny the mascot treatment she has been given since her debut in 2017. My final candidate for PlayStation mascot is an easy one, and that's Astrobot. This guy has all the makings of a mascot. He's cute and marketable. He represents the brand, and I mean that quite literally because his whole character and game is based around PlayStation. Astrobot has also become a go-to character for new PlayStation tech, being featured in the Playroom, a pre-installed app on every PS4 console. The Playroom was always a weird one to me since it was mainly for the PlayStation camera, and I literally didn't know a single soul who owned the PS4 camera. Oh, also when I googled the Playroom for this video, it brought up a strip club near me, so that's all my search history now. Anyways, Astrobot got his first full game with Astrobot Rescue Mission, a game showing off PlayStation VR. And then Sony went back to the character for Astro's Playroom, which is pre-installed on every PS5. By the way, if you own a PS5 and haven't played Astro's Playroom, go do that right now. Sony even featured Astrobot prominently on the box for the PlayStation Portal. It's clear that Astrobot is a mascot type character, and having him featured across basically all of their hardware, oftentimes being pre-installed for everyone, gives him a pretty good argument for PlayStation's mascot. And when looking online, a lot of people seem to have accepted him as mascot. To be completely honest though, I think it feels a bit too early to give him that title. I just don't know if he has the worldwide brand recognition yet that I consider necessary for a mascot. There are rumors that we'll be getting a new Astrobot game in the near future, maybe even this year. If that game is a hit and the character continues being used, I could absolutely see a reality where Astrobot becomes the full-time, undisputed PlayStation mascot as we head towards the end of the PS5 lifecycle and as we move into PlayStation 6. But for now, I personally feel it's still a bit early. I'm having a really tough time choosing between my top three of Kratos, Aloy, and Astrobot. In terms of recognition and popularity, you have to give it to Kratos, but I'm not sure he fits as a mascot. If we're looking at it from Sony's perspective, their treatment of Aloy and Horizon sure feels like a mascot to me. But there are too many naysayers for that character to ever be completely accepted into that role. Astrobot has a really good argument, and a lot of the online gaming community seems to have already accepted him as mascot, but I do personally feel it's a little bit early. Ultimately, I think it's a toss-up between these three for me, so I would like all of you to decide. Who do you see as PlayStation's mascot? Is it one of the three that I mentioned, or is it someone else entirely? Let me know in the comments below.